Hello and welcome back to my channel. It's Saturday and it's become a bit sultry and grey outside after a blasting hot day yesterday. So it's not quite comfortable today. I'm having a reading day, which is delightful, and my post was pretty good. I got a replacement copy of one of my favourite books, which Christopher Isherwood's Goodbye to Berlin, which I first read in 1990, and the copy I got then, my Methuen paperback, fell to pieces completely. All the pages fell out. They were heavy, really lovely pages, and they all fell to pieces. And I got this replacement a number of years ago, which I've never really got on with. I don't know why. It's funny. And I keep thinking it's something to do with the way it's laid out. Not very nice margins. And the last time I sat down to reread Isherwood, I stalled and wasn't enjoying it as much, and I put it down to the fact that it was this copy, which is maybe unfair on Minerva. It's got a nice George Gross cover as well. But on eBay this week, because I was sorting out that bookcase with all my favourites in, and of course Goodbye to Berlin goes on the second shelf in 1990, the spring of 1990. I just happened to look at eBay and somebody was selling, well, lots of people were selling the folio edition from 1975, and this was a good price, this copy. It was about the price of a normal everyday hardback coming out today, so that's a good thing, I think. The same George Gross pictures on the front and back, and illustrated throughout with George Gross drawings. So it's one to treasure. 75 they brought this out. I hope it's still in print like this. Don't know. I think the pictures inside are all black and white. Yeah, they're fab. And you see lots of margins, lots of margin space. That makes me happy. Oh, they're really nice pictures. They make me think as well of the novels of my friend Brendan Nash, who writes novels set in this period. He is someone who runs tours, walking tours of Berlin, following Isherwood's life in the city. Something I've not done yet. I haven't met Brendan yet, but when we go to Berlin eventually, we'll go and do his walking tour and explore all these Isherwood spots. That's lovely to have, and it fits very nicely on my fancy bookcase. In 1990, it slots between the first of the Tales of the City books by Armistead Maupin and the short stories of J.D. Salinger. That was a very successful spring of reading that year. Now, at the moment, I'm on with about 9 things at once, which is 9 or 10 things at once, which is crazy, I know, but very summerish. This is my pile of reading with all the bookmarks sticking out. And, oh, also here, these larger format things, comics and what have you, storybooks. This came my way, a Peter Haining Book of Ghosts, which is from the 70s, reprinted in the 80s with more pictures. And I dipped into this yesterday and discovered the fact that in the 19th century, it was a known thing, schoolboy prank, for boys to melt candles onto the back of tortoises and set them free at night in churchyards and graveyards to scare the living daylights out of people as they saw these candle glows waveringly making their way between the stones. I love that. And I'm going to use it in a story. I was reading these again yesterday, the Doctor Who backup strips, which I was reading the stories of Absalom Dark, Dalek Killer, and Death World. these are the strips at the back of Doctor Who Weekly back in the late 70s. So they're things that I was reading in the summer holidays of 1979. It's very nostalgic. And I've got Scream to go back to as well, to dip into. So comics, I've talked about some of the other things I've been reading. Margaret Atwood's stories, James Blish. I'm not sure what I think about this. I'm nearly finished it. I'm not really enjoying it. Every now and again, some of the writing is just stunningly good. But he gets quite sciencey. That sounds so stupid. There's lots about education in this, which is interesting. There's this whole idea of hypnopedia, in which people are have knowledge programmed straight into their brains. And in chapter 5, there's a brilliant defense of learning not by rote, but through experience, through reasoning, which is a wonderful corrective to the way education in this country seems to have gone in recent decades. Chris's schooling left him very little time to explore it. Not all his education was machine education either, for, as he slowly realised, no one really learns anything through hypnopedia. Machine teaching at its best enables the student to accumulate nothing better than facts. It does not show how to tie them together, let alone how to do something with them, to train the intelligence, not just the memory. A real human tutor is required. When you had the Tory government decrying and devaluing experts in everything, teaching was amongst that, university teaching, school teaching, and they just thought putting more tests and more targets in place was the way to do things, and it's never right. Teaching is about training people, resilience, how to have resilience and how to teach themselves and how to question and be difficult, not just take in facts and figures. I mean, Dickens talked about that, didn't he, in Hard Times, with Gradgrind. It's a cliche. It was a cliche back then in the 19th century, but we seem to have not learnt much. I was going to tell you about this. I have talked about this before, Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers, and it's interesting reading this 50s novel about paranoia and aliens and invasions, secret invasions, at the same time as I'm watching and rewatching the early X-Files episodes. I was getting a bit bored and cheesed off in the middle because there was a lot of repetition, a lot of standing still paranoia, and then running about the house, and this romance plot that was coming through as well, that always has to be there. But then there's a bit where they go to the deserted town, they return to their deserted town and go to the small town library. And this is an absolutely stunning scene. It pulls together so many lovely ideas, and it's really chilling as well. So we're introduced to this library, and he's our narrator, whose name I forget, Miles, Dr. Miles Bennell. He's very nostalgic, and he sees Mrs. Wynadot, and she's the librarian. She was there when he was a kid. She'd been librarian since I was a grade school kid, coming in for Tom Swift and Zane Grey books, and she was the exact opposite of the conventional notion of what a librarian usually is. She made the place, made it a nice place to spend a pleasant hour or afternoon, a place where people met friends to talk quietly, smoking and discussing books. Wow, and just reading things like that makes me think about how much I miss libraries. Locally, we fought to keep a library. We had an old Carnegie building that's now been turned into a community centre that is controlled by gatekeepers who don't let anybody apart from their friends do things in it, which is a shame. But we lost that library and we got a new library, which is a room underneath the new recreation centre where you can't sit. It's a one-stop shop kind of place where there's meetings and computers and a few books. And in town, it's a similar story. Our lovely old central library turned into something out of Star Trek. And of course, they're doing anything to get people in there. So there's hordes of children running about. It becomes a creche. That's what they do. And it's just too noisy. And I used to write in there. I used to go in the library in town and write. Oh, I sound like a really grumpy old bugger. But, you know, where is that place where you go and sit and there's tablefuls of journals and magazines and you can think and work? We've lost it. It's not important. Again, it's the Tory idea, I suppose, that you just download information. You upgrade facts. You don't sit and dwell and think for yourself. And that's the first thing they do when they want to control people, is take away that space for public thinking and self-direction. Anyway, they go to the library and they're looking. They want the old newspapers from a year ago to see if these evil seed pods from space were reported on. They know they were. And they ask Miss Wynadot. It's a funny name. Wynadotte? Don't know. And she brings the huge journals of last year's papers, but when they open them, there's articles razored out hastily. There's gaps in the record. On the bottom half of the May the 5th issue was another hole just about as long, but only 2 columns wide. It wasn't a guess, but a sudden stab of direct, intuitive knowledge. I know, that's all. And I swung in my chair to stare across the room at Mrs. Wynadotte. She stood motionless behind the big desk, her eyes fastened on us, and in the instant I swung to look at her, her face was wooden, devoid of any expression, and the eyes were bright, achingly intent, and as inhumanly cold as the eyes of a shark. The moment was less than a moment, the flick of an eyelash, because instantly she smiled, pleasantly, inquiringly, her brows lifting in polite question. "Anything I can do," she said, with the calm, interested eagerness typical of her in all the years I had known her. "Yes, would you come here, please, Mrs. Wynadotte?" Smiling brightly, she walked around her desk and crossed the room towards us. There was no one else in the library now. It was 26 minutes past 12 by a big old clock over her desk, and the only other patron had left a few minutes before. Miss Wynadotte stepped beside me. I glanced up at her, and she stood looking down at me, her expression pleasantly inquiring. I nodded at the hole in the front page of the newspaper before me. "Just before you brought us this file," I said quietly, "you cut out all the references to the seed pods found here last spring, didn't you?" She frowned, bewildered by this accusation, and leaned forward to stare down in surprise at the mutilated paper on the low round table. Then I stood up to face her, my face a few inches away from hers. I said, "Don't bother, Mrs. Wynadotte, or whatever you are. Don't bother to put on an act for me." I leaned closer, staring her directly in the eyes, and my voice dropped. "I know you," I said softly. "I know what you are." For a moment she stood still, glancing helplessly from me to Becky in utter bewilderment. Then suddenly she dropped the pretense. Grey-haired Miss Wynadotte, who 20 years ago had loaned me the first copy of Huckleberry Finn I ever read, looked at me, her face going wooden and blank, with an utterly cold and pitiless alienness. There was nothing there now in that gaze, nothing in common with me. A fish in the sea had more kinship with me than this staring thing. Then she spoke. I know you, I'd said, and now she replied, and her voice was infinitely remote and uncaring. "Do you?" she said, then turned on her heel and walked away. I gestured at Becky. She stood, and then we walked out of the library. Outside on the sidewalk, we took 6 steps in silence. Then Becky shook her head. "Even her," she murmured. It's just brilliant. And that mask slipping, the kind of affable, over-professional, slick and glib, kind of grinning customer service face that we see so often, dropping and showing the coldness of a shark in the eyes underneath, is absolutely terrifying and so relevant to now, to these days. So that's good. That was a good read this morning. I'm going to stop and go back to my reading. I hope you're all well, and there's no body snatchers around where you are. And I hope you have a nice library as well. I feel disappointed in the provision that we have here. I don't need a giant spaceship full of all the bright and shiny new books. I need somewhere that's dusty and filled with all the old books, the books I don't have. Anyway, goodbye, and I will see you again soon in the next episode.